Hey minions, it's me. I want to take a moment to acknowledge the finalists for Custom Faction Month for all those who submitted their custom factions. I really enjoyed this process. My brain is a little fried at the moment just because we got many more submissions than I was expecting, and some of them were really high quality. Trying to figure out which ones would be the best ones to feature on the channel was not an easy decision, but I'm really excited for those that made it, and I want to thank everyone who participated. Regardless of your selection process, I thought that there were a lot of really creative ideas in there and some really interesting overlapping of ideas between people that probably have never met each other. That was really interesting for me. Before I reveal the winners, I want to acknowledge two very important points about the contest. The first is that if your faction was chosen, this doesn't mean that I think it's done. I think that your work is just beginning. As I mentioned at the start of the contest, this is never really about balance, although balance has to be a consideration at some point, and there were some ideas that were really interesting, but just a little too much on the first onset. It's very hard to balance a faction. You can't play it a couple of times and say that it's good to go. You have to check to see if it locks up the game, if it has interactions that are too powerful, is it too weak in the average sense. So I never really expected that any of the factions that were chosen were done in a sense. There's more work to be done. It means that you had a really solid foundation based on what I was judging by, and I wanted to thank you for that, but know that we have more work to do. That's basically what I wanted to say. The second thing I wanted to point out was because of the difficulty in trying to figure out which ones to show, I fluctuated on the number a lot. This was something that was very difficult for me and really stressed me out pretty much most of today. It was a question of, do I feature less people and honor the fact that it is a contest because I want the people who are chosen to be chosen because they are in fact the best. But for the people who are just on, the edge of making it, can I maybe find some more time to feature some more people? That's a very difficult balancing act. And I decided to focus on 10 total entries. There was always going to be 12 spots. Some of them were going to be going to me because there are some things that I was really excited to show on the channel and finally had some time to do it because we weren't doing the other series. But I felt like 10 was a good number between having enough people to show a great diversity of ideas while also respecting that, you can't show everyone. And given the number of submissions that we had, it's a very good ratio. I was really happy with the number, much more than I thought I was going to get, even though it created more work. So if you're being shown, it means that you've earned it, and you have an opportunity to share your ideas. That's always what this was about. It was about sharing ideas, celebrating the community that we have, which is absolutely fantastic. And without further ado, I want to get to the finalists. But first, I wanted to acknowledge two people who were so close. I had a really hard time, and their ideas are good enough that I wanted to acknowledge them as, if I were to do this again, these would be among the first people that I would contact back to revisit those ideas. So unfortunately, you're close, but you just missed the cut. Those are, and I apologize if I butcher anyone's names, I'm sorry. I can't exactly ask people how to pronounce their names without giving it away. Those two honorable mentions are Corey Marino for his Bigfoot faction. I really liked it. I thought it was great to revisit the berry mechanic. There's just others that I liked more. And Francisco Izzo for the Fosterford Suburbia, which I didn't even know what that meant. I had to look it up. But it's apparently like the Stepford community of weird neighbors. I thought that was really interesting about forcing your opponents to take madness in order to avoid abilities as opposed to giving yourself madness for powerful abilities. So for the actual winners, these are not in any particular order. These are just the order that it makes sense to talk about them. The first one is Blackjack for his Celtics faction. I really like this faction because it centers on the idea of Curse of Uselessness and not adding power to a base, because I often talk about how you don't want to let other players use your own power, and this faction is based on canceling your own power until the timing is appropriate, and I thought that was really clever. A similar faction with a different endgame kind of reverses it, and that's Adam Brenner and the Fisherman. What the Fishermen do is that they bait people to playing onto particular bases so that they can get rewards. In other words, if you're the Fisherman, you might incentivize me to play on the base so that I'll get a reward, even though it's going to benefit you in the long run. I think that's a fantastic concept, and it definitely fits my playstyle of wanting people to do. I always talk about baiting players into doing things, and this faction takes that quite literally, and I thought that was really clever. Another kind of risk-reward type faction that I really enjoyed was the Gamblers from Major Bevis. The Gamblers want to stack the deck in a certain way, that way you can get a minion or an action, but it's not exactly, it's not trivial. If you're guessing on what's in your deck or what's in your hand, if you're wrong, you get penalized for it. So you definitely want to pair them with a deck manipulation faction or feel confident in what you're going to get. And I thought that was a really clever idea and very elegant. Definitely something that reminds me of Wishing Well in Dominion, which is always a card I'm talking about really wanting to see in Smash Up. The next idea was something that just clicked, and that's the chefs from Vespert. The idea of the chefs is that they put power counters on actions, which is allowed by the rules, but they don't do anything. And it turns out that the power counters are basically staged on the actions, and then you are moving them around from base to base, and also eventually activating them, sort of like We Will Rock You. I thought it was a really clever way of using the fact that that counters can exist on other types of cards, but they don't do anything unless a card tells you to, and these cards actually tell you to. The next two, mechanically, are probably the closest of the ones that were selected, and I took both because I feel like the discard pile is such a big part of the game, and zombies scared us off of the discard pile in the beginning. There's still a lot we can do with it, and these factions both did something very interesting with it, but in different ways. The first was the Yokai from Luca Pellegrini, and the Yokai have an interesting slingshot-like mechanic, where their cards want to be in the discard pile, but they have a means of being played from the discard pile whenever you activate certain abilities. So you've got a little bit of your sifting through your hand and strategically positioning your discard pile with an ability to play them out back into bases. And also focusing on minions being minions and actions being actions and trading between the two. Really interesting stuff. The second was the Skeletons from Austin Chun, and the Skeletons also care about being in the discard pile, but they want specific cards in the discard pile because they do different things. It's sort of like you get a bonus if cards stay in the discard pile, and they are self-recycling as well, which sort of mirrors like a life cycle of the card. You know, I go into play, I go into the discard pile, and there are some clever ways that use what are honestly fairly ordinary abilities, like just simply drawing a card. You normally wouldn't do that, but it has a greater purpose behind it, and I thought that was really clever. The next one is the Sand Realm from Sonus. This faction does a lot of interesting things. It uses printed power in a meaningful way, focusing on lower powered minions. It focuses on ability cancellation, and that's something that we really don't use a lot. We typically cancel other people's abilities, but we rarely cancel our own, and there's unusual ways of disrupting minions, and I thought that was really clever, and there's some really interesting synergies there. The next one, I don't know how to pronounce this name at all, so I'm just going to call it the Anime Brothers from Moira Arrington. The Anime Brothers, they want to duel other people's minions, but what makes them different is that there's a sense that the duel is getting bigger and bigger as the game goes along because minions add additional stakes and additional abilities into the duel. All of a sudden, which minion who duels matters. Usually it's my highest is going to attack your lowest, and I'm just going to win. But this faction brought up a lot of ideas as to what it means to duel, and I'm really excited about those changes to dueling, because dueling can be a little controversial, and that's probably a topic for another time. But I really like the idea of these big epic battles between two parties that are just culminating in a massive fight. And I'm excited for everyone else to see that as well. The last two are the closest thematically, but they don't really have anything to do with each other mechanically. The first one is the Ironman faction from Gian Piero Giacomini, and I initially thought this wouldn't work because it only had one minion, but then I realized that's exactly what Tony Stark would do. There's actually a quote I like from a TV show. It's Avengers Assemble, if you've ever seen it. It's fantastic. He says, "One of me is more than enough." And I just think that's a really interesting idea for a faction. It uses the actions with power in a way that feels like it's very straightforward, and it also uses the armor subtype. A lot of people used subtypes, but this was the one that I thought did the best with it. And it feels like the kaiju without the kaiju. A lot of people think the kaiju can be a little broken. This feels a lot more straightforward and not out of control. I'm not saying that the kaiju are out of control. They can very often feel like they are. And I thought this was a great way to revisit actions with powers. For the final one, this is submitted by Toby Fabinger, and he basically modeled Thanos and the Snap. And the reason why I like this one is because I think there's an opportunity for something that I've always wanted to see in the game. I think the rules support it. In fact, one of the factions that I'll be demoing this month has it, and that's an alternate win condition. As in, stop the game, you won. I think that not every faction should have an alternate win condition in Smash Up. You can make an argument that the aliens do, and I think that the idea of the snap, which if you haven't seen Avengers in Infinity War, come on, I mean, it's already been a year. I just think that's such an epic moment, and he captured that in the game really well. But I think that the idea of having a long-term goal, if you can't win by points, there's a difficult but viable goal that you can do in order to win the game. I think that's something that could really be interesting for the game, and I wanted to celebrate that. So those are the winners. Congratulations to you if you got your faction picked. I'm going to take a little bit of time off this weekend because my brain is fried from having to review so many submissions. You'll get more instructions from me via email in the coming days, and then we'll figure out how to make this thing work. Again, I want to thank everyone who participated. We're going to have to do this again. Unfortunately, Phase 2 has to start at the end of September because there's a strict timeline. Otherwise, I'd find ways to feature more people, but if Phase 2 is going well, and if there's time, I'm definitely interested in revisiting some of the ideas and getting to know some of you a little bit more. Thank you so much. Let's shut it down.